there's so many things to think about and talk about in the wake of the Las Vegas shooting, and they've been talked about on this show quite a bit. I will say that there is another aspect of it that some people might not have thought about, which is for the victims of the shooting who were taken to hospitals, how much are they in for in terms of medical expenses when all is said and done? There recently was a report put out by the peer-reviewed Health Affairs journal, and it found, quote, gun-related injuries result in nearly $3 billion in hospital costs each year in the US. Patients were charged about $5,000 on average for emergency department services and nearly $96,000 on average for inpatient services, according to the study, which focused on patients who were alive when they arrived to the emergency room, just to tell you who they were studying in this case. And Market Watch adds that this is likely an underestimated figure, as is mentioned by the writers of the study. They say that this doesn't focus on the extra costs like rehabilitation, readmissions, and lost incomes while you're recovering from and being treated for your injuries. So just that number is around $100,000 for being the victim of a gunshot and going to the hospital. So what are your reactions to that number?
So it doesn't quite fit with the argument that we make when it comes to Wall Street, doing the shady things that they do, betting against us, and some of the damaging behavior to our economy. But when it comes to Wall Street, we always argue that they privatize the gains, socialize the losses. And in this case, we're not talking about the government, forcing Americans to pay anything, but we are talking about private US citizens who are victims of gun violence having to pay the costs associated with insanely lax gun regulation. And these types of medical bills destroy people's lives, right? And far too often when we talk about the gun debate, we focus heavily, as we should, we focus heavily on those who lost their lives. But I think that it's important to have a conversation about people who were severely injured and who did have their lives changed in an incredibly drastic way because of getting victimized by this.
Yeah, I think it's such a heavy debate because only when I talk about things like this do I get death threats on on social media, or when I get people that get very volatile, when people think you're trying to take their guns away. But the reality of it is that somebody pays the price eventually. And even that country singer who actually stood up and said, I was wrong. All that I thought about guns, people around me had guns and no one could help, was just the reality that so many people are not willing to come to terms to until they are personally affected by tragedy. But this is, like that's a double tragedy. Do you know what it is to be in recovery and then still have to worry about being in debt? And it's just that's the medical part. But you know that there's a mental health component to this, to some people who are gonna need therapy for post-traumatic disorder. And that is also a tragedy. And it just makes me so sad that people get so volatile when you think about regulating guns, but it just trickles down into places that you don't even think about. And now over 500 people are gonna have to worry about their finances in addition to healing physically, emotionally, and mentally.
First of all, I just wanna mention that country singer who said, I was performing when that all went down, and the statement that he made is a brave statement and one that I'm glad happens at all. Whether you disagree with it or agree with it, I'm glad it happens at all. That is someone who looks at the facts, goes through an experience, whatever it takes, and readjusts their position. What I will say is the way he frames it, his first sentence is something like, I was a fierce proponent of the Second Amendment until last night.
Yep.
And one of the aspects that's so sad for me is the extent to which the other side has won a part of the debate by making him frame it that way.
Right, exactly.
Like you're either a proponent of the Second Amendment or you're in favor of gun control. And what I would say to him and others like him is that those two things aren't necessarily at odds with each other.
Right.
A lot of rights that we have are limited in decent, smart ways that you would agree with. And I think there's a lot of common sense gun legislation that still says that Americans who behave a certain way, who are able to be licensed and pass certain checks, can still have a gun and haven't behaved in a way, or if they're a victim of if they're suffering from a mental illness or whatnot, like we can still defend the Second Amendment and restrict who is able to get it.
You're absolutely right. And the people that have framed this issue as a black or white issue are, the weapons manufacturers, the gun manufacturers, and the NRA, because they don't want an intelligent discussion on it, right? They want to frame anyone who would do anything, pass any type of legislation that would limit the profitability of these weapons manufacturers as anti-Second Amendment individuals. And that's just not true. Now, are there people who, are, I don't even want to say radical, but people who are on the extreme end of the spectrum who say, no, we should ban all guns? Yes, those people absolutely do exist. Is that representative of everyone who's trying to have a legitimate conversation and debate about gun legislation? Absolutely not. And I've been open about that. I've talked about, my own desire to own a weapon for self-defense. And so that doesn't, just because I think, someone like Paddock shouldn't have had the ability to buy a product that essentially turned his semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon, doesn't mean I'm against the Second Amendment. It means that I'm concerned about human lives. I want to limit as much as possible the amount of people who lose their lives when some insane person decides that they want to open fire on a group of people.
And that statement is you agreeing with something that most people agree with.
That's right, yeah.
It's difficult in Nevada. I read a Newsweek article that reported that they have certain laws where there's a very little limitation on what you have to register when you purchase a firearm and whatnot. So it's difficult, but what it comes down to is a lot of research needs to be done. And there's problems with the system that we have that dissuades research from being happened. We're gonna skip to graphic 3, and this is a statement from the people who did the report that I mentioned earlier. They say, although firearm-related injuries are a major public health concern with significant financial consequences, research in this area has been limited as a result of a lack of funding. Only through the adoption of an evidence-based public health approach can the resulting substantial medical and financial burden be reduced. And there are limitations on how much research can be done. And it's due to, I forget what the name of the amendment was. It's the Dickey Amendment, which was put on the omnibus spending bill back in the 90s. And it said that you can't take CDC money, Center for Disease Control money, which is involved with allocating funds in order to research public health threats. And it says you can't use it in order to do research that could contribute in some tangential way to gun control legislation.
Well, the gun lobby doesn't want that information out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but it's so difficult. There's an amazing video where President Obama was on PBS and someone asked him a question. And he says, I was in a meeting today where I want to limit people who have access to guns, who we put on other lists, and I want to research this the way we researched, say, auto safety,
right?
And the way that resulted in seatbelts, and I can't do that because there's no way we can research freely. And what's so ironic to me is it's called the Dickey Amendment, and then in 2015, Governor Jay Dickey, the late Governor Jay Dickey, whose name is on this amendment, said this to CNN. He said, "It is my position that somehow or some way we should slowly but methodically fund research until a solution is reached. Doing nothing is no longer an acceptable solution."
When was that?
This was in 2015, before he died. This is what the article I found on CNN is from 2015. And if the guy whose name is on the amendment on the omnibus spending bill that just gets passed through despite everyone trying to pull it out on the Democratic side, if he can change his mind on this, then anyone can.
Anyone can, as long as they're not influenced by that money,
Absolutely.
right? From the NRA, from the gun lobby. It's a powerful form of controlling lawmakers, and that is the one and only reason, the main reason, the primary reason why our lawmakers, some Democrats included, refuse to do anything about gun control.
And it's become such an emotional argument. It's like a mass hysteria because they've tied in patriotism with owning a gun, and it's become So as a comedian, you know, we were directly affected by that NRA ad that was very volatile because they actually mentioned comedy clubs in there. Like when we're like the enemy of the NRA because the NRA came for us. So the volatility in comedy clubs has increased, and now we have to worry about somebody who's in the audience that could potentially have a gun that doesn't like what we have to say, and consider what we say to be un-American, because now everything is either you're pro-American or anti-American, and if you kneel, you're anti-American. If you shoot guns, you're pro-American, to this type of mentality. But it's really scary for those of us who are people who are actually exercising our American rights. I have people put on my Facebook page that this is the greatest country in the world because we can own guns in case the military comes to get us.
This is not the greatest country in the world. You have been misled by jingoistic propaganda. It's not the greatest country in the world because we have lawmakers who are completely ineffective in leading, in protecting our fellow Americans. We have a government that's disgustingly corrupt. We have a government that purposefully puts our soldiers in harm's way merely for the profit of weapons manufacturers and private contractors. No, this is not the best country in the world. And if you don't believe in anything I'm saying, I mean, take a look at our statistics in education, in healthcare, in all of the essentials in life compared to other countries. We are not the best country in the world. I think that the idea of America is incredible, but we don't follow through with that idea. We like to, you know, swing it around and pretend as if that's something that we value, but we just talk about the idea of America. We don't actually put action behind it. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I know that might have hurt some people's feelings, but that's what's really going on.
I get your rhetorical stance and why you're saying it and how you're saying it, but your dog is not the best dog in the world, but you still love it more than anything else.
That's a great way of putting it.
Absolutely.
That is a great way of putting it.
I agree. But you know, the reality of it is if the military comes for you, do you really think you got a shot with your whatever you have?
Yeah, but I believe there's like this fantasy.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah, it's like cause your gun safe is in the same room where you watch 300. You watch it and you're like, yeah, you know, I could take down Persia or the equivalent.
By the way, just real quick, going back to the death threats that you're getting from gun advocates. I mean, if they're trying to make the argument that we need looser gun restrictions and then they simultaneously threaten your life, I don't know, I feel like they're being a little counterproductive, maybe a little bit.
If you like this video, you probably like independent media. The best way to support independent media, become a member of the Young Turks. TYTnetwork.com/join.